Um, Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I'm Zeba, and we're going to be talking today about anxiety and what that means, first of all, and then how to overcome its symptoms. And the reason I have to talk about what it is first is so that we understand why we have it, why it happens, and that's a really important part of how we end up combating it, right? So anxiety is the mind and body's reaction to stress, to danger, to unfamiliar situations, and it looks like it kind of manifests in our body in different ways. You kind of maybe will feel thoughts which are negative, which are intrusive. You'll feel worry about things. How am I going to get that done? How am I going to pass that exam? How am I, are those people going to like me, right? Like all those kinds of questions swirling in our head. It's a sense of uneasiness, distress, and honestly, it's a very natural part of who we are, and it's Allah's way, actually, of giving our bodies a alarm system. It is there so that we are able to fight off and react in a way that keeps us safe, right? It's alerting our body to any kind of danger that might be around us. And there's so nothing, but what happens is when this feeling, when this worry starts to take us over so that we can't do the everyday things that we need to do, that's when anxiety becomes a problem. Some of the other things that go on in our heads, so there's thoughts, right? Negative thoughts, but there's also these feelings of dread or panic, actually, kind of coming out of nowhere, kind of feeling outside yourself, like you're not really inside your body. Physically, you may notice your heart rate increases. You'll notice maybe you feel your stomach drop, your muscles tense. Some people even get like feelings of nausea. And sometimes actually the heart rate increases so much, and the feeling of panic gets so bad that it almost feels to people like a heart attack. And people have been to the ER in what's come to be known as panic attacks, and it looks like and it feels like to that person as if they're having a heart attack. But there's actually no medical symptoms that would prove that you've had any kind of cardiac event, right? But it feels that way. Some of the behaviors that will come out are, skin picking, hair picking, nail biting, avoiding certain people, avoiding certain situations. A lot of younger kids actually end up with GI issues, intestinal stomach problems, and just kind of this vague kind of stomach pain. A lot of interrupted sleep, hard time falling asleep, right? So these are a bunch of the physical symptoms that you'll see in anxiety. A lot of people get anxiety in their relationships, right? Whether it's with friends and peers at school, whether it's with a significant other, you're constantly worried about what they're thinking. Do they love you as much as you love them? Like these constant kind of guessing games you play in your head about what that person is thinking of you. And it's some of it is very natural. Some of it is very, it's okay, it happens. But again, these symptoms develop into disorders, and there's a medical classification called anxiety disorders, when they get in the way of you going to school, you going to work, you having healthy relationships with people. Oftentimes, anxiety becomes comorbid with depression. And by comorbid, I mean a lot of their symptoms of anxiety and depression are the same. For example, like the sleeplessness, the isolation sometimes that happens, right? It's very typical in anxiety and depression, and that's because it involves kind of the same neural pathways in our head, and that's why those symptoms end up looking the same, right? So all of this is just to give you an idea about what anxiety is, right? There is some chemical reaction going on that is causing these symptoms, okay? And again, some of it's very natural, very normal. It's our body's way of alerting us to danger. It just sometimes, for some people, we're always 24/7 in this heightened state of awareness. And that is when it starts to get us into trouble, right? Some of the disorders you may have heard of, I mean, just to give you names, the one basic generic one is called the generalized anxiety disorder. And that one, again, it's when this heightened sense of awareness is lasting for like 6 months straight, right? It's not just a week, like, you know, you have an exam coming up and so you're really stressed and anxious about it. That's not generalized anxiety disorder, right? Like, that's just normal anxiety. It has to last for 6 months. It has to interrupt your sleep patterns for during those 6 months, right? It has to, like, you know, some people, actually, these behaviors, some of these we talked about, like, there's one very specific one. It's called tachytillomania, actually, is what it's called, and it's the nervous tick. It becomes like you pick your eyebrow, the hair on your eyebrow. You pick a spot on your head and you keep picking that hair. And that's an anxious symptom where you actually lose hair in those spaces because you've been picking that hair from there. Extreme nail biting, right, where people have bit their nails all the way to the quick, right, to the end. These show up as anxious behaviors that, like, would be considered problematic because they've gone so far. You've heard of OCD, right? That's a very common word in our culture nowadays. It really stands for obsessive compulsive disorder. And again, those symptoms have to last like 6 months, where, you know, I've heard of people who will go to the bathroom, for example, to make wudu, and they'll be in there for an hour making wudu, right? Repeating it because they feel like they haven't gotten it right. Someone will pray Asr for 2 hours because they feel like they didn't get it right. And so they're repeating the behavior again and again. So these are things that kind of show up, and we see these things and we classify them as disorders because of how extreme they are and because of how long they last, right? How those behaviors last. I'm going to kind of segue in now in terms of how do we overcome these things, right? How do we, and yes, there are medicines, psychiatric medications for anxiety. They are often, like, the doctors will prescribe them, but they will 100% of the time tell their patient that, look, you also need to do some kind of therapy with that, right? Medicine alone is not as effective. You have to develop strategies. You have to develop coping skills that help you in that moment of anxiety overcome whatever it is that's your anxious behavior. And the thing to remember, like I just talked about how anxiety impacts the brain and the body, it's important to consider a holistic treatment, right? You have to look at something that impacts mind and body, right? Like the drugs are, yes, helping with chemicals in our brains, right? But we also have to do something to help our bodies overcome the anxiety. And it's because if you let anxiety go rampant, sometimes we tend to choose unhealthy coping mechanisms, right? A lot of times people will turn to drugs, right? Because it makes them feel better. People will turn to alcohol because it kind of dulls your senses, right? And it removes your brain, it stops your brain from constantly thinking about the thing you're worried about, because what does alcohol do, right? It makes you lose awareness. It makes you lose your kind of consciousness of things. So it's important to find healthy coping mechanisms. It's important to practice those healthy coping mechanisms. to use in a moment where you know you're getting anxious, right? And I think the first one that I'll talk about is we really have to make an effort to increase our level of what's called distress tolerance. Okay? What is distress tolerance? Distress tolerance is the ability to tolerate something stressful that's going on around you, right? And the only way you can do that, and so some people have distress tolerance like up to here. Some people have it up to here, right? So how do we increase that? How do we increase distress tolerance? The first thing you have to do is you have to really unpack some of these, what we call cognitive distortions that are going on in our heads. Statements like, oh man, I always fail at that, right? Like that's a cognitive distortion, those kind of always and never statements. They're not usually true, but in that moment we highlight them and we make them feel real, right? So telling ourselves in that moment that those statements are not helpful, right? To rethink the way we react in a moment of, you know, something that goes wrong, right? Like how do we deal with something that goes wrong? If we're thinking like this, it's very hard to build up distress tolerance, okay? If we're always thinking that this is the end of the world right now. This happened. Oh my gosh, I got into an accident. You know, my parents will never let me drive again. You know, like things that we just end games, which are very, very negative, right? Very, very, you're not thinking out all the options. You always go to the worst conclusion in that situation. So unpacking those cognitive distortions, distracting yourself in a healthy way, okay? Whether that's, you know, you see that, you feel that cognitive distortion coming on and you think, okay, wait, let me go for a walk. Let me go talk to my friend. Let me go get a drink of water, right? And some of these, like, if you heard me say these things, they're almost from our sunnah. You hear what I'm saying, right? Like when you get up and go drink a glass of water, when we're angry and we want to calm down, what do? We sit down, we lie down, right? We take those steps to make ourselves calmer. This is another like step to distract yourself. Another thing, and it's, you know, it's not easy, but it's a very, very healthy way to look at life. Whatever bad thing that happened in that moment, what's the silver lining? It's not easy to see sometimes. My mom, may Allah have mercy on her, she sometimes would end up in the hospital for like weeks and months, right? She would be in the hospital. And anybody would say, yeah, it's no fun being in the hospital. It's a terrible thing, right? She, you know what her silver lining to that was? Oh, but Zeba, you know what? You spend more time with me when I'm in the hospital. You're with me in the hospital. And so that's her silver lining, right? Like you have to look for the silver lining, even in difficult and you know, awful circumstances. This is again from our deen, from our sunnah. Allah asks us to do this, to look for what is the good in these things. And with that comes this last thing I'll say, and you know, it's called radical acceptance. What does that mean? This thing happened. Me trying to fight that thing when it's already happened is not useful. This thing has happened. You know, I have cancer. My loved one passed away. These are awful, horrible things. Nothing good about them. But they happened, and I can't change that, right? Like understanding what is in our control, what is in our ability to do. It really, really helps us increase our tolerance for these things because we're not fighting it anymore, right? We're not like enraged by what's happened to us. We've accepted it. This is qadr from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This was meant to be. You were meant to fail that exam. You were meant to miss that flight, right? It was in your qadr that was going to happen to you. You accept it, right? Because see, once you accept it, then you can problem solve for it, right? Then you can figure out what to do next. Because if you're stuck in a situation where you're just like, oh, why did this happen? oh my gosh, this happened, and you're stuck in that moment, it prevents you from thinking of the next steps, right? It stops you from that moment. So that radical acceptance is really an important part of increasing our distress tolerance. And the last thing I'll mention about increasing distress tolerance is finding ways to soothe and calm yourself. And you know what works for you best, okay? Some people, you know what? They just need a cup of tea to calm down. Even though caffeine is not the best calmer, right? Caffeine is an activator, right? It increases your activity level and your kind of agitation. But some people just need, like my dad will say this, like, I just need a cup of tea before I sleep. Like, I have to have my chai. What is your way of calming down? Is it going out for boba? Is it, taking a hot shower? Is it lying down for a few moments peacefully? Is it sitting out in your backyard? Is it going for a walk, right? What is it that calms you down? Is it a hug from someone you love, right? Who are those safe places? Who are those people that help you feel calm? I can't answer those questions for you, right? You have to find your places of calm. You have to find your places that soothe. The next thing, right? The first one was what? Increasing distress tolerance. The second point I'm going to make about overcoming anxiety is we have to improve diet and exercise. Those are very easy, actionable ways to improve, to kind of combat anxious symptoms. I just talked about chai, but caffeine is going to exacerbate anxiety. It is. So if you're not used to caffeine, especially for people who aren't used to caffeine, right? Some people can drink like 4 cups of coffee a day and it doesn't really make a difference to their bodies because they're used to it. But if you're the person that you drink 1 cup and you're just wide awake, that is something you should avoid. When you may be facing, you're going outside, you have a big presentation, you're kind of nervous about something, you avoid those kinds of things. Really sugary and highly processed foods also aggravate anxiety. And all the things I'm saying, like eating healthy is always going to be better for you, right? It's always going to be helpful in terms of making you feel better. Berries are really high in antioxidants. Those are really good for you in all sorts of ways. Olive oil, Mediterranean diet, turmeric, haldi, right, in Urdu. It actually helps reduce the effects of cortisol. Cortisol is our stress hormone, right? And so it reduces, it kind of counteracts cortisol. So there's a lot of things we can do in our diet to help reduce this anxious symptoms. Exercise, going for a walk. So remember, anxiety is there to give you a boost of energy to combat a perceived threat, okay? What's that energy going to do if you just sit with it, right? It is going to sit in our bodies. It is going to sit in our brains. Our brains are just going to go round and round with worry and thoughts. Our bodies are going to internalize that stress, whether it gets, the heart rate increasing, or we get all warm, stomach aches. All this stuff is that excess energy. So release the energy. The best way to release energy, some kind of exercise, right? Go for a walk, go for a run, whatever it is that helps you. It doesn't have to be like, super aerobic exercises. Even a walk, a 20-minute walk, especially outside, if you can get some fresh air, if you can be around greenery, very, very helpful. Exercise also, it produces feelings of accomplishment, like, oh, yes, I did this, right? And that combats those negative feelings we were talking about, right? Increasing distress tolerance, improving diet and exercise. The third one I'm going to talk about is deep breathing, okay? And by deep breathing, we don't normally deep breathe, okay? When we breathe, it's just a normal part of what we do. We don't even think about it. But when I'm talking about deep breathing exercises, I'm talking about you actually have to think about your breath going into your body and out of your body. And it's where you hold the breath all the way down in your diaphragm. Um, One of the ways I find it easy is to do something called box breathing. So you like breathe in for a count of 4, and you hold it there for a count of 4, and then you let it out, counting to 4, and then you hold it down there for a count of 4. So it's like that 4, it's like a box, and you take your time doing that. It requires us to concentrate. You can't do deep breathing without concentrating on it, right? Because our body's natural reflex is just to breathe. So it really helps. First of all, take our mind off of whatever we've been worrying about, right? Because now we're having to focus our mind on the breathing. But it also activates, it's what's called the parasympathetic part of our nervous system, okay? And that, it helps induce calmness and relaxation in our bodies, that just breathing alone. And I don't think we understand how powerful the impact of oxygen and that level of oxygen is on our bodies. It helps actually for you to fight through pain. Women who have very severe PMS symptoms and even menstrual cramps, you can use those deep breathing to help you reduce pain in your bodies. It's a really important part of healing our bodies naturally. I really think, and here's the thing, if you're in a moment of stress, it's hard to remember to do those things unless you've practiced it before. So I really suggest people, like, maybe at night before you go to sleep, in the morning as soon as you wake up, make it a ritual that you practice just 5 minutes of deep breathing, right? Just so your body knows that you know how to do that. And it's easier for you to remind yourself to do it in a moment where you need it. There's another kind of similar thing. It's called a muscle relaxation exercises, where you actually go through all the way from top to bottom your body, where you tense up your muscle and then you relax it all the way. It takes about 15-20 minutes to do all the muscles in your body that way, but it really helps your brain focus on something other than the anxious thoughts. Helps your body to relax. Number 4, meditation. And this is something, you can combine this with your adhkar, actually. It's really helpful if you have a daily practice of what you do. And meditating on some of the words, some of names of Allah, or when you say Alhamdulillah, like really thoughtfully understanding, what does that mean? What does Alhamdulillah mean? What does that mean to me in my life right now? That kind of meditation, again, is a way to calm the mind, right? Because the breathing exercises, the diet, the exercise, all of that stuff, we're calming the body, right? We're kind of relaxing the body. Now we need to work on how do we calm the mind? And meditation is one of those ways where you super focus on the meaning behind something, the word behind, whatever that is. It doesn't have to be complicated, right? Very simple things will help us, but it's just that repeated meditation on one thought, one idea, something to start your morning off in a positive way, right? It is always helpful. And it helps reduce just our negative reaction to stressful thoughts, to distressing thoughts. It's a powerful tool. It's a powerful tool that we can use. Some other alternatives, and again, you're gonna have to find what works for you, right? There's a lot of different resources here. Massage has been known to really be therapeutic when it comes to reducing those anxious symptoms. A lot of us, we carry our stress and anxiety in our shoulders, and you'll feel sometimes that pain in the neck and shoulders. Massaging that area will relieve you of some of that stress. It'll feel very relaxing. Acupuncture has been helpful for anxiety and stress. yoga, if people practice that, right? And again, finding safe, calm um, places where you feel at home is going to be a really helpful tool in combating some of these anxious symptoms. And subhanAllah, it's important to remember that anxiety, just because you have anxiety, does not mean that your faith is weak. I think that's a really common misconception in the Muslim community, that um, I work with so many clients who are either anxious or depressed, and often the solutions given to them are, oh, just read more Quran, or make more dua, or do these kind of religious rituals, and you should be fine. And if you're not fine after doing that, it means you're not doing it right, or you don't believe enough, or you don't believe strongly enough. And that's really harsh for these people to hear, that they're weak, or that they're not good enough, and that's why they're having these thoughts. The Prophet ﷺ gave us dua to help combat anxiety and depression. Why would he give us those dua if it wasn't a problem he knew we faced, right? It's very common, it's very typical, and it's not something that we should belittle people for having. And I think that, or to degrade or humiliate people for feeling that way, and reduce their iman for them like that, right? Like that's very unhelpful, right? It's not benefiting them or you to do something like that. There's one dua that you may have heard, and it encompasses anxiety, depression, and all sorts of things. Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-hammi wal-hazani. Right? What is that beginning of that dua says? Oh Allah, protect me. I seek protection in you from hammi wa hazani. And it's good because it encompasses both, right? Ham is actually anxiety, worry, right? And hazan is grief and sadness. So encompassing both the and interestingly, like if you think about anxiety, it's concern about the future, right? It's that uncertainty, like you're not sure what's going to happen, that causes you that plagues you. And hazan is grief over what's past, right? So we're worried about our future, and we're sad about our past, and we're not living in our present, right? That's our challenge. We're constantly either looking back or looking forward, and we're not living in the moment that we can actually have any impact on. So this supplication, this dua, actually addresses both of those issues, and it's important to know that we have this resource for us, that we can ask Allah for help to get us through some of these things, but we also have tools that we can take action, that we can use these resources to help get us through some of these phases of life. And sometimes things happen. Sometimes people, especially who've gone through very difficult childhoods, who've gone through some severe trauma, their distress tolerance is very low, right? I mean, imagine a child, who's never known safety, right? Who's always, whose parents died, they're in foster homes, they're not cared for, they're not loved, they're beaten, and that is all they know. So they're always in this constant state of awareness. They're not feeling safe anywhere. So for them, they're constantly worried about what's about to happen, because they've experienced life at such a young age that was very unreliable, and so they're very concerned about the next whatever's going to happen to them. And so we have to understand that people like that, they need a lot of help, and they need a lot of support, whether that's through medication or these other resources that we talked about. And it's not just that their faith is not strong, or they have not had the chance to build up resilience, right? They haven't had that afforded to them, that time afforded to them. SubhanAllah, I think that was it for my presentation, Inshallah, and I would be happy to open it up to answer questions if anybody has anything to ask.
How do you go about in situations where, say for example, you're like a teacher or you're in a situation where someone else you may not know too well is dealing with anxiety, and you're just like, how do you kind of navigate that situation? Or say it's like a parent, right? Like a lot of times you'll see it's hard for kids to almost comfort parents, right? And so how do you kind of navigate that situation?
Okay, so the one thing about anxiety to understand is to appease anxiety doesn't work, because anxiety is like a black hole. Like I will have parents who, I don't know, they constantly need to know where their kids are. They're tracking them. They need a phone call every 30 minutes. They're very anxious, right? And I see that a lot. Appeasing their every anxious need does not relieve the anxiety. It doesn't. That person needs help, whether through just talking to somebody or medicinally. Parents don't usually listen to their kids, right? In that regard, and you know, unless you know you're older and you've gotten to a point in your relationship where they're going to listen to you. But it's a very hard situation. You know, it has to be coming from a place of authority, whether maybe you have a trusted, you know, aunt, uncle, elder, somebody who can talk to them, right, for you on your behalf, and kind of just sit them down and say, look, you know, we need to talk about this. This is not very healthy. And that kind of parenting actually creates anxiety in children. Anxious parents end up having anxious children, and it's possible to go back from it, right? It's possible to rewire, and it's possible to get healthier from there. But one thing I want to say is, like, look, sometimes people just have an anxious, like, fitra, like they're just anxious, and that's okay. And I see this a lot in relationships, right, where one person is just, the word nowadays is something like, you know, they're very needy, or they're very dependent, right? They're constantly needing attention, and that's not a problem if their partner understands what they need, right? And so they don't need, not that they need constant reassurances, but they need to know that they're loved. They need to know that they're cared for. With parents, I think they just need to know their child is safe. You know, like, and especially I've noticed this in our South Asian parents a lot. And I don't know if that's I kind of feel like that's a transgenerational trauma from the whole colonization and partition experience, where so many families lost so many things, right? In that whole, and then it was so traumatic that they had to cling to everything, and they had to protect everything really hard. So some of it's kind of hardwired, right? Like that anxiety. So to maybe have a system with parents where you're like, okay, mom, I am going to call you when I get there, okay, and I'll call you when I'm leaving, and that's all. Like you kind of contain the anxiety, right? And then you place your limits there. For example, I have, you know, clients who have some of these the OCD disorders, where, you know, they're praying for 2 hours. You know, they keep repeating the prayer, and I tell them, okay, look, the first step in that, we're going to tell ourselves that we're only going to give ourselves 30 minutes. Okay, we're going to set a timer, and we're going to limit the amount of time that anxiety has control over us, like that. So placing some of these limits may be helpful, and writing it down, right, and being very specific and very transparent about what actually is going to happen, and so you can do that much, but it's never like, anxiety is a black hole. You can't appease it. There's no way. Anything else?
Is there a way to handle perimenopausal or menopausal anxiety, or we can only take medications for it?
I think it depends. I think all the things that we talked about right now help. Again, there's no cure. Like sometimes people are looking for a quick fix, or like, how can I erase this? How can I just make this disappear? That's not going to happen. We just have to learn how to manage it, right? In those moments, is this the time where I need to use that deep breathing? Right? Is this the time where I'm just getting so, I'm hyperventilating to a point where I need to leave this situation, I need to go sit down somewhere, and I just need to breathe for 5 minutes. I need to get away from this, right? So understanding those cues of what you need in that moment, understanding what your triggers are, because anxiety is triggered as well by certain things. So kind of reducing your exposure to those triggers. Are you, some people are triggered by, myself. I'm always triggered when I'm running late. Like, that just gets my heart rate going. I'm like upset with myself. I mean, I need to be on time. How to avoid that then, right? Like, okay, I'm going to leave like 15 minutes ahead for whatever I need to go to, or something like that. So understanding yourself is really important when it comes to managing our anxiety. But perimenopausal anxiety itself, I think that will more have to do with diet and exercise. I'm sure we'll have something like that. And just, I think it depends on what your symptoms are, and different things would apply in that situation. Yeah. Anything else? No. No questions. Nobody has anxieties, or we're here because we have people we deal with who have anxiety. You can turn that off.
Well, sometimes we think that we are okay. Like, I never think like I have anxiety until my daughter, she's like, "Oh, you're always anxious," and you're I'm like, I feel okay. I don't feel like I have anything. So, but she's like, "No, you need to calm down." I'm like, "Me or you?"
Some of us have very high functioning anxiety. And you know what that translates into? It translates into always being prepared, always planning, having lists of things, having you're always thinking, like, I used to do a lot of event organizing for the masjid, and people are like, "Oh, you do this so well," and I'm just like, you know what? I always think about what can go wrong. My head is constantly spinning about what can go wrong, and so that's why it looks great, but it's a lot of stress, isn't it? Like, constantly worrying, constantly trying to figure out what's the plan B, what's the next step, what do I do if this happens? You're always in that constant motion of trying to make sure nothing goes wrong. And at the end of the day, really realizing that we don't have control. That's one prescription for anxiety, is to kind of accept. I was talking about, the qadr of Allah and stuff, that you don't have control over a lot of things. And accepting that really helps to kind of diffuse anxiety. Because again, it's about, what can I do for that next step? Like, what's going to happen? What can I do for that? How can I fix that? How can I avoid that? Right? It's always those questions that kind of go. Where anxiety gets, I think, really scary is, some of my clients and stuff, they have negative thoughts that start to circle, and that ends up sometimes getting into like really negative thoughts, whether that goes into self-harm or suicidal ideation. That's when it gets really, really dangerous. And for those situations, there has to be some extreme measures that need to be taken, whether it's medication or sometimes, inpatient hospitalization, that in those cases, because that anxiety has gotten to the point where it's just harming, right? It's physically harming them in those cases. So,
and sometimes our teenagers, like the children, we don't realize what they go through, but sometimes inside they're going through some stuff that we don't even think about.
No,
Or they
no.
put a face that they're okay, but in reality they're going through personal stuff.
So one of the it's considered a disorder now, but one of the things that's really coming up a lot among young people, especially even older though, is social anxiety disorder, right? Where and it's pretty typical in adolescence, where young people are very concerned about what other people are thinking of them, right? It just kind of it's pretty natural to kind of be worried, but that gets overused into the point where they really freeze up to even go into social situations, and our digital world is not helping that at all, right? So the social anxiety, I mean, like I had a client who she couldn't even get in her car to go anywhere. She couldn't leave her house. She didn't want to see anybody. She didn't want to meet anybody. She didn't want to talk to anybody. I mean, that's debilitating, right? So those things are happening, and it's being compounded by the digital world and what they're perceiving from outside, right? And that constant worry about, oh, so and so looks so good and I look so bad, right? Like that, the whole body image issue with young people especially is aggravating that as well.
Such anxiety is also triggered due to the hormones, like the thyroid gland or some kind of.
I mean, cortisol. It's a stress hormone, right? And if there's any kind of imbalance in the way and with young people especially, there's a lot of hormones going on, right, as they're growing. So all of that is thrown into the mix. So it gets.
So for the anxiety you just talked about, she's not able to sit in the car or function normally. So that is something medical, or is it like a?
It would have to be probably both. That's so extreme, right? Where there are so a lot of the anxiety medications, they're almost, they try to lower the stress hormones, right? They try to some of them are what they're called SSRI inhibitors, and they work with the neurons in the brain and stuff, right? That is one way of attacking anxiety. But again, anxiety is a whole body problem, right? It's and so you have to work with it behaviorally too. For example, if someone is afraid to get in their car, yes, we can start medications, but we also have to help them get in the car. Maybe like say, okay, we're only going to sit in the car for 5 minutes today, right? And to kind of like give them that kind of exposure therapy so that they start feeling comfortable alongside with the help of the medications, but just getting them to do some of these things. They would need some kind of assistance to move forward in that thing.
And to recognize, like, if we have any family member that we know that they're going through this, sometimes we ignore it because it's not socially accepted, or they're going to say that I have a brother that is crazy or whatever. Because sometimes I hear like some of my students, they're super calm, they're super, like they look perfectly normal, and I get this email that says this student is being admitted in a mental rehab. Like that's too, like, from where? Like I was not even aware. But if we as parents, as siblings, as spouses, as children, like we need to, because a lot of these things escalate.
I mean, it's going to depend what position you have, right? If you're a teacher, sometimes you may get a clue, sometimes you may not. Because some of these really anxious kids, they get really good grades. They turn in all their homework. They look like model students, right? But sometimes there's a lot of pressure, and I remember when my kids were at the Plano high schools, I think Jasper, there were cases of suicide because they got a bad grade. They something like, right, like this is mental health issues that make it look, that don't look terrible, like their grades are fine, or, you know, they're the captain of the football team, they're in debate, they're doing all the things, but at home, right, there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of stress. They're lying awake at night thinking about, oh my gosh, what if I don't do well on that exam, right? Like that is going on, and sometimes it's hard to see. Sometimes it's hard to see if teachers aren't seeing it and parents aren't seeing it. The kid's not getting the help they need. And again, if it's extended family members or even, you know, parents, and you're not really in a position to help them, they won't listen to you. Find other avenues to approach them, right? Like find someone else who maybe they will listen to and say, look, I've noticed these things, and it's getting in the way of their living, right? It's getting in the way of them having a relatively normal life, right? Doing the normal things that need to be done. I had a young girl, so sometimes anxiety like that is caused by certain things. So this girl was bullied like day after day after day on the bus for the 23 minutes. She knew the time, like she knew I was on the bus for 23 minutes. And the kids on the bus would make fun of her repeatedly, right? She didn't tell her parents, she didn't tell anybody else, she just kind of went through it. But one of the things they were making fun of her for, was that she smelled bad. So she ended up, every morning, she would get up at 5 o'clock. 5 o'clock in the morning, she spent an hour and a half in the shower. Hour and a half just trying to get clean so she wouldn't smell. Like that was the way her anxiety manifested. And that took a lot of medication, a lot of talk therapy to get her to open up about that. Like she wouldn't even tell me, like 6 months in is when I found out that that's what happened. She couldn't even talk about it. So it's hard. It's really hard to see it sometimes. Mom didn't see it. Mom didn't see it until she found her daughter cutting. And so I don't know, I tell all parents, you know, make sure you can see your kids' arms. You know, every once in a while, I mean, I know we have haya and sharam and we shouldn't look at our kids, but keep an eye, you know, pay attention, because cutting does not necessarily lead to suicide, but it is a sign that something's wrong, right? It is a sign that there's something wrong, there's something going on, the child needs help. You guys have questions?